Welcome, everyone. My name is Sally Edwards. I am Director of Retailer Engagement with the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today entitled Products with Purpose, the Living Product Challenge. For those of you who are not familiar with the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, which we call the GC3, the GC3 is a multi-stakeholder collaborative that drives the commercial adoption of green chemistry by catalyzing and guiding action across all industries, sectors, and supply chains. And on this next slide, you'll see our vision and mission. Our vision is a world where green chemistry is standard practice throughout the value chain. And the GC3's mission is to drive the commercial adoption of green chemistry by catalyzing and guiding action across all industries, sectors, and supply chains. We now have over 140 members that represent many different industry sectors and all parts of the value chain. This slide just shows you a snapshot of some of those members. For today, the ground rules are the following. Due to the number of participants in the webinar, all lines will be muted. If you have a question or a comment, you can type it into the questions box that you'll see in the control panel, and we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So I want to introduce you to our speaker today. I'm really delighted that Alexandra Muller, who is the manager of living products at the International Living Future Institute, will be speaking today. Alex's work at the nexus of green building, design, and manufacturing focuses on the transformation of the materials market to ensure a built environment with healthy products for everyone. Alex holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Delaware and a master's in sustainability and technology from Purdue University. She began her career in environmental conservation and then found her niche in materials research, the problem-solving challenge of developing certification standards, and the stakeholder engagement to accelerate industry progress. I'm really looking forward to Alexandra's presentation, and I'm now going to turn it over to her.
Thanks so much, Sally. Good morning. If you're on the West Coast like I am, I'm based in Seattle, and good afternoon, just about, if you're on the East Coast. So my name is Alex Muller, as Sally noted, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Living Product Challenge. And I'm not sure how many of you on the line are really familiar with the International Living Future Institute, where I've worked for the past 4 years, but you may recognize some of these programs. So we are a nonprofit based in Seattle, but with staff and reach really around the globe. And our mission is really to provide the vision for a more sustainable future, really looking at how to create a world that is socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. And we do this through a range of work, really a variety of programs, and some of that is multi-attribute certifications like the Living Building Challenge, which is our flagship program, Living Community Challenge, and Living Product Challenge, which is what we'll be talking about today. And in addition to that, a number of transparency platforms for buildings such as Reveal, for energy, for companies and social justice like the Just label, and for material ingredients with the Declare label. And really the purpose of what we do and the purpose of our organization, right, is to provide this vision for what does good look like. And I think that all of our programs really try to reflect those ideals of instead of trying to create buildings that are less toxic, use a little bit less energy, use a little bit less water, how can we create buildings and communities and products that actually have a measurable positive impact on society and on the environment? And so as you can see from, what looks like sort of a disparate group of certifications that we have, they're all kind of nested together for the most part, with transparency labels like Declare, feeding into multi-attribute product certifications like the Living Product Challenge, and trying to push for having living products within living buildings, within living communities. And so today, as I said, I'm going to be talking to you about the Living Product Challenge, which is in its 2.0 version now. And the Living Product Challenge is designed to be a holistic framework and certification that is third-party verified, and once again is really trying to push beyond harm reduction and impact reduction to really measuring, maximizing, and celebrating the good that companies can cause in the world. And one of the things that really sets apart our program is that push towards creating more good, and also a focus on transparency, and how can we make information and impact publicly available so that consumers have the information to make these decisions, and also so that we can sort of accelerate transformation over time by not redoing good work. So looking at engaging with LCA, demonstrating safer ingredient selection, responsible social impacts, and a myriad of other requirements. So the program is set up with sort of the metaphor of a flower as the living building challenge is, which is really looking at kind of having 7 petals or impact areas, from ones that you would typically expect, right? Like water, energy, materials, etc. But then also looking at health and happiness, looking at equity. How is the supply chain impacting the individuals who work to create these products? Is the product beautiful? Does it give back to society? How does the facility fit in with the place and the ecosystem where it's situated? So really trying to look across all areas of the product and its production to push towards having truly sustainable regenerative products. So within those 7 petals, there are 20 imperatives which are laid out here, and I won't go through all of them right now, but within the place petal, as I was saying, sort of looking at the facility site, making sure that that the grounds are cared for, that pesticides aren't used on site, that you are actively creating habitat for species in the area, making sure that you are contributing to habitat exchange programs to help offset the use of resources, et cetera. And then looking at water, right? Kind of looking at having a responsible water footprint, and then creating a product that can actually create more potable water through its creation and use than it requires to actually produce the product. And we'll be talking about that concept of shrinking your footprint and creating handprints. And so the same would apply for energy. Health and happiness is then looking at red list or sort of toxic chemical avoidance, and then going deeper to do an assessment of the material health within there. Materials, looking at where materials are sourced from, looking at waste at the facility, and also looking at carbon, decreasing carbon use, trying to create carbon sequestering products. Equity is looking within the supply chain, looking at how money is invested for different types of nonprofits, and also making sure that the company or the manufacturer is transparent, using a just label about their company's operations, their HR practices. And then looking at something called social co-benefits, which is taking handprints and thinking about how can those also have a positive social impact. Beyond that, of course, inspiration and education. Education is really crucial to what we do. It's a huge part of how we create impact. We like to talk about doing sort of education and then advocacy and then certification, because those really become the foundation of change. So there are 3 different pathways, or sort of 3 different levels of certification within the Living Product Challenge. So the initial one being imperative certification. You can see the dark blue imperatives that are highlighted there. Those are the core requirements, so it's a minimum to achieve imperative certification. petal certification beyond that requires those imperatives plus 3 petals, one of which must be the water, energy, or materials that are highlighted in light blue. And then full certification requires achievement of all 20 imperatives. And I think a question that you probably get a lot in certification is, there's so many product certifications out there, and we all know this, and I suffer from certification fatigue myself. And so I think all of our programs have really come out of a place of, where is the missing piece in the market? What are we, where could we be headed that certifications aren't pushing us towards right now? And I think what was observed in the case of the Living Building Challenge and then the Living Product Challenge is that there were a lot of standards and certifications from, minimum government standards all the way up to multi-attribute third-party programs that are transparent and everything in between. But really all of those still had a focus on how do we take our negative environmental or social impact and how do we start to decrease that? But nothing was really moving to the other side, right? Which moves us towards restorative. And this concept of hand printing was really been pushed by Greg Norris, who's now at MIT, who is a colleague of mine, and he's a world-renowned life cycle assessment expert. And I think what he'd really found over time is that there's something really demoralizing to this concept of sustainability and a focus on footprint sometimes. And all of the certifications out there, right? Even those that were looking at LCA, which not a lot of them actually are, if they were looking at that, it was only thinking about how can I help to decrease my footprint, right? And if your footprint feels unavoidable, which it is, everybody has a footprint, everybody has multiple types of footprints. It's hard to imagine sometimes how you can actually be a part of the solution. But what the Living Product Challenge and this concept of hand printing started to ask is, what if we started to think about impact in a different way? And what if we tried to not just sort of shrink our unavoidable negative impact, but what if we also started to think about our potential for positive impact? And beyond that, what if your capacity to actually give, to do more good, outpaced your need to consume? And so I was saying earlier that these are sort of not ILFI sanctioned slides, but I've tried to find ways to sort of represent footprint reductions and the creation of handprints over the years. So if we're trying to think about this concept of hand printing, I like to sort of start with something simple, right? Something we would work on, like a chair. And if we start to think about, the impacts of that chair, and you're a manufacturer, right? And you say, well, I want to have a chair that actually has positive impact. So what does it actually take to make this chair have positive impact? Well, I think the first thing that you would end up thinking about, right, is, well, okay, we make these chairs, we have them at our final facility, and so what we should do is work to make our facility net positive, right? So let's put in some rainwater capture, we'll use that for agriculture, and any water usage on site. We can also put in solar panels to offset the energy, or wind, and really work to make that facility have a positive impact, which is fantastic. However, as I think we all know, a lot of the time, there's a lot of impact that falls outside of that final facility. And so within the Living Product Challenge, what we ask manufacturers to do is kind of first look on site at your facility and make sure that your operations are net positive for water and for energy. But then outside of that, we really have to recognize that in a lot of cases, 80–90% of the impact of creating a product is actually upstream in the supply chain through resource extraction and transportation and transformation of materials. So what we've done is have a requirement that says, yes, you have to be net positive on site, but then you also have to go and look at the life cycle, complete an LCA for your product, and attempt to offset the impacts of that. And so net positive really within our program the definition is that you look at both of those scales to become net positive. And so what we're trying to do, right, is think about your footprint first, right? It's always incredibly important. We can't skip that to move towards handprints. But if your footprint is essentially your mess, right? It's what it takes to sustain you, to sustain your company, to sustain an organization, a country. What we want to do is work over time to sort of shrink that mess, right? And I think that all of us in our own ways are trying to do that. But the issue is that no matter how hard you try, you can never have a footprint of 0, as I was saying. And in some ways, the more that you shrink your footprint, the less return you get on each investment, right? We can see that with building energy efficiency as well, that it can be incredibly frustrating sometimes. You can shrink and shrink and shrink, and then at the end, you sort of end up with plug loads, for example, that are the bulk of the energy impacts. But what we're trying to look at within this program is that there's so much that actually falls outside of your footprint. Simplest way always to think of it, right, is what could we do if we planted a tree, right? That's the example we give a lot. And the question is, you know, if we start to think about the good that falls outside of that footprint, we can often know that we're doing positive things, that we are having an impact, right? But sometimes it's hard to know how much good are you actually doing, and can you quantify it? So if our footprint is this big on the left and we plant a few trees on the right, are we done yet? And so what we've tried to set up within the program is a real measurable definition of what net positive is. And the idea of handprinting is that it uses the same tools, the same metrics as your footprint. So you can measure your footprint using LCA. You can also measure your handprint or positive impact using those same tools and metrics. And so we can start to create and we can start to build handprints that start to approximate the size of our handprint, right? And at a certain point, your handprint can actually start to exceed your footprint. And within our program, that would make you measurably net positive. And the neat thing is that you can actually go as far as you want, right? You can become wildly net positive. And so, like I said, it's, you know, it's not just sort of saying, well, are you doing some good outside of here? Well, that's great. The idea is really within our program to be able to measure that, to be able to quantify and demonstrate that through the creation and use of a product, that you can actually create more positive impact than negative. And we're sometimes asked, like, why do you bring in LCA into this program, and why the concept of handprinting? And the way that I think about it is, right, that we all have a responsibility to know and shrink our impacts across all of our impact areas. And beyond that, I believe that we sort of have a collective responsibility to look beyond those footprints and work to create positive change anywhere and everywhere. And so if we sort of think of this as one person's mess versus humanity's over there, if you were just to sort of work on cleaning up your own mess, I think that we would really fall very short of what is needed in society to create the type of and scale of change that we need at this time. And so later I kind of have a couple of actions that were put into place by manufacturers, but just to give some examples of how to create handprints, right? One way to do that is to donate energy efficient light bulbs to employees or consumers. You can track the installation and start to measure the impact of how much energy is saved versus what types of light bulbs would be used previously. Conduct energy efficiency audits of facilities, of other companies' facilities, you know, go work at schools and do the same. Water efficient fixtures can also be used and then can be used to educate students about sustainability, create cost savings, and also incentivize investment in further sustainability actions. And that concept of kind of putting a handprint into place, right, conducting some sort of good, and then having that ripple out and create more positive impacts is something that we think about a lot, right? How can you create these ripple effects very intentionally to have a very outsized handprint at the end? Educate farmers that produce bio-based ingredients for your products, about water efficiency practices, about health and safety, et cetera. And, you know, plant trees, save a forest, create habitat, educate and try and look at what the impacts of that education are, inspire others to take on hand printing. So the possibilities are really endless. And I think that's what this program is about, right? Is that it's really time to move beyond the production of goods that make the world a little bit less bad in some ways, to products that really make the world a better place. And I think that as manufacturers, as producers of things, that's what everyone is working towards, across environmental impacts, across social impacts. And so it's something that we want to be able to measure and celebrate and push even beyond within this program. So to come back to sort of the specifics of the program, these are the basic requirements for achieving living product certification. And so those core requirements are laid out on the left. So looking at the facility site, looking at having a responsible water footprint, energy footprint, avoiding materials that are on the Living Building Challenge red list of sort of worst in class chemicals we would try to avoid. Responsible industry, looking at sourcing of materials, looking at the labor risk within supply chains, and then, you know, requiring this piece around inspiration, education, and how do you tell the story of living products, and how do you get others to start thinking about hand printing some of these concepts. So to look at sort of different areas of requirements, right? This program requires having an ISO compliant LCA or an EPD, obviously, that's looking at the product's cradle to grave impacts. It requires having a third-party verified declare label, which means that all of the ingredients at or above 100 parts per million or 0.01% of the product are represented publicly and are screened against the Living Building Challenge red list. Having FSC to 100%, for all of the wood-based materials or timber, including packaging, they must be certified to FSC labeling standards or from salvage sources. I will say that in some cases, it's been really difficult for things like corrugated cardboard to do that. And so we do have an exception that says if you cannot meet that, and you can demonstrate that you've done enough advocacy and outreach for that, that one would be able to use 100% recycled sources, or SFI. Human rights due diligence, as I was noting, looking at the top 10 priority suppliers based on spend using the social hotspots database, and trying to identify critical social risks and thinking about how to prioritize suppliers that sort of align with your sustainability and social sustainability goals. And then lastly, of course, looking at education materials, having an annual open day at the facility, because it's important to sort of bring the community into the facility to have an understanding of what's being produced there, and you know, an understanding of health and environmental impacts. So moving beyond that, for achieving pedal or full certification, we start to bring in some of these larger areas of impacts, right? So protecting human and environmental health by going beyond just having transparency around those ingredients, but engaging a material health assessor to dive deeper into those materials, conduct green screen assessments, and share that information publicly. Also moving beyond kind of just having a responsible footprint on site and in the life cycle to actually having net positive sites and creating handprints that are greater than your footprints for water, energy, and carbon. Also looking at the site to make sure that the creation of waste is reduced and that the end of life is responsible for the product. promoting social justice within the organization by obtaining a JUST label, which is used to disclose organization policies and performance around equity, diversity, inclusion, and other impact areas. And then there's this other neat idea, and I think I have an example from one of the manufacturers that's thinking about this concept of social co-benefits, which was not in the first version of the program. So we just had looking at net positive for energy, water, carbon, etc. And when we started to talk to some of the manufacturers, and Mohawk Group has been really one of the main ones to lead this conversation. There's a question when you create handprints, right? When you offset water use, when you donate water efficient fixtures, when you plant trees, there's a context question that comes into play, right? So you can have the numbers add up and be net positive. But if you can also think about the context and who is impacted and who benefits from handprints and who receives education about renewable energy and installation, you can start to think about how could we create the most positive impact per kilowatt hour, per gallon of water. And I think that that's a pretty powerful concept. And so it's one that we're trying to reward by basically saying, if for one of your handprinting areas, the action that you put into place, you can demonstrate that it has social co-benefits, have a narrative from any partner organizations, demonstrate how people are impacted, then that's an imperative you would be able to achieve. And so this is an example of the label, right? Because as you can see, there are a lot of different areas that are brought together within this certification. And what our goal is, right, at ILFI, when we represent that information, is to make it elegant, to make it accessible, so that if you're somebody who's looking for a product, you can kind of take all of this complex information and represent it fairly simply. So knowing the number of imperatives that were achieved, the level of certification, where the product is produced. A lot of manufacturers have EPDs or LCAs that are done, right? But nobody often takes the time to look through that full EPD to look at all of those impacts. And so we've tried to represent the hotspots of impact, right? What are sort of the 5 top areas of impact, using these dials, looking at waste impact, having the declare information represented simply among a number of other impact areas. And this is a slide that George Bandy from Mohawk Group uses, but he has talked about kind of why they've invested in the Living Product Challenge, and there's a number of different areas, but one of the things that he always states is that what he really appreciates is that Living Product Challenge kind of meets everything that he's trying to look for in a certification program, right? So being third-party verified, having ingredient screening, having public ingredient disclosure, chamber testing, etc., but also having these net positive requirements, right? How does a certification actually set the goal for where we want to go, not just where we want to be in sort of a year or two, and also taking into account social equity and social supply chain requirements, which are things that are near and dear to him. And this is just kind of an overview of, you know, when you're looking at that number of different impact areas within the program, there's LPC is now recognized within Living Building Challenge, LEED v4 and v4.1, the EPA Eco-Label program, and the WELL Building Standard. And so I have a couple of examples of different things that have been done by manufacturers, because I think that what's really key about the Living Product Challenge, right? We have this basis in having products that are, you know, that are safe for use and disposal, that have decreased and then their impact and tried to create positive impact, that are looking at the social impacts. And I think that what the program does in some ways is, you know, require all of these sustainability attributes, but also provide a really important platform for looking at the, you know, for being able to tell stories about a product. and I think that that's really crucial. I think that a lot of different companies have a lot of pieces that they're working on, and it's hard to sort of bring all of those together. And so, as a couple of examples, for the place pedal, this is Human Scale's facility, and Human Scale creates ergonomic products and a lot of office furniture is what they're known for. And before they did the Living Product Challenge, they were, I think, known for some of their sustainability work, but for the most part, I think they weren't certainly a leader in this. And after taking on the program, they've really kind of emerged as a leader in this field. And so when we think about the place, we try to think about how is the facility impacting the nearby grounds. How are you being responsible for the environment there? How are you making sure that you're not building on green space? So this is a walking path that they have around there, and they make sure that they've done some cleanup of the river around there, and it's a healthy space for employees in the community to be able to enjoy the land around the facility. And this is an example from Mohawk's facility. So Mohawk started off by creating one living product a couple years ago, and they were sort of dipping their toe into it, and they created a product called Lichen, and it's ended up being actually, I think, their best-selling product ever. And they moved last year to making 5 different living products, and so they started to scale. And this year, they just released their first platform certification, which is really looking at how do we really start to scale the impact, and how do we start to think about handprints in a much larger way by tackling many products at once, and how do we think about how that affects the site as well. And so on their site, they're on a certified wildlife habitat in Glasgow, Virginia. And one of the things that they've put into place and made a robust program is their beekeeping on site, actually. And so I think that they have probably over, I can't remember exactly how many, maybe over 1 million or 10 million bees that are providing honey, and some of that is being used for the local community and for employees, but really trying to promote pollination and help to serve local pollinators. The water imperative, once again, is looking at how to create net positive impact through the production of the product or through the company's engagement, and is another example from Mohawk. But what they did ties in both water and social equity, and they ended up donating. So they worked to sort of reduce the footprint of the product as much as possible, and make sure that on site they were using, that all of their water was cycled. And then what they did was create a hand printing strategy where they donated water efficient fixtures to Morehouse College. And now they've done this with, I think, probably 4 other colleges and universities, historically Black colleges and universities. And Morehouse College was George Bandy's alma mater. And they donated the shower heads because they had really old shower heads that were really inefficient. And they've ended up saving a ton of water for the dorm rooms and different facilities on site. And a portion of the savings that the school gets through those shower heads, they require that be invested into other sustainability projects. Additionally, the students were a part of installing that and understanding the impacts of that donation. And so really trying to think about, how do handprints have positive social impacts? How do they have ripple effects? How can you kind of create more and more good? Another neat example is kind of a collaboration between 2 different living products. So back when we started the program, we engaged with a company called Borreo. And Borreo was started by a few surfers who were basically fed up with ocean plastic, ruining the oceans, and out of a desire to really protect what they loved. And fishing nets are responsible actually for really the majority of ocean plastic. And they can be highly problematic because obviously they're very persistent in the water and they can continue to catch wildlife over time. And so what they did with their product and what they wanted to certify were the plastic pellets that they create out of recycled fishing nets. And so they work with local communities in Chile to actually connect those, to collect the nets, to clean them, to recycle them and turn them into pellets. And the money from that investment goes to sustainability projects in those local communities. And if you are to use their recycled nylon 6 rather than virgin nylon 6, what you would find is that you can actually have a positive impact versus business as usual. And so Human Scale ended up creating the Smart Ocean Chair. So they had the Smart Chair, but what they did was they incorporated Boreo's plastic into the chair for the maximum amount that they could. And so for every chair that's actually created, you have a positive impact versus what you would have done with nylon 6. And this is Human Scale's label. Human Scale has a living product label for both their smart chair and their float table, and they are the only manufacturer thus far to achieve full certification. Equity is thinking right about the supply chain, thinking about risk in supply chain, and once again also thinking about how you can have sort of social co-benefits from handprints. So Target achieved living product certification for 2 products last year, and part of what they're working on, they have 2 different kind of hand printing strategies, and one of that is working with Earth Enable. They were essentially, they've partnered with Earth Enable in the past because Earth Enable is trying to tackle the sort of public health crisis that comes with dirt floors in a number of different countries. There's a lot of kind of water and breeding ground that can happen for mosquitoes, dust being kicked up, and how that impacts lungs. And so Earth Enable had developed a natural floor that was made of natural materials like clay, sand, oil, etc. That was sort of, an affordable, healthy flooring option that had a smaller footprint. And Target ended up partnering with Earth Enable to do a number of things to help them spread the impact of what they were doing, and also shared with them some of their flooring techniques, and is providing linoleum in some cases, which is a natural flooring material, to help even decrease the footprint further of what they were doing, and help improve the viability of those floors. So once again, trying to think about how to create positive impact that goes beyond just the footprint of your product, and how does that also have positive social impacts as well. And just as a quick last example, I think one of the other things that's really powerful about Living Product Challenge is this component of education, but also employee engagement. So Jane Abernathy at Human Scale likes to share these photos from when they pursued the Living Product Challenge. So I think this is their zero waste team in the beginning, trying to figure out how the heck they were going to achieve having zero waste for their entire facility. And I think, everyone was sort of on a different page, and it seemed like a very difficult challenge for them. And by the end of the process, when they were certified for the Living Product Challenge product, I think what she observed was that there's a huge amount of employee engagement benefit that she saw through the program. And all of us, it turned from, well, okay, Jane needs this information to achieve these sustainability requirements, to I'm actually a part of creating a positive impact. I'm a part of our handprint. I'm a part of making this happen. And I think that was something really powerful that she observed. So I'm just going to touch on one more piece that's sort of tangentially related to the Living Product Challenge and what I work on, which is the Living Product 50. And when we started this program, what we really wanted from manufacturers and at our different conferences and ways that we would engage with them was a space to update manufacturers on what we were working on, what was happening with the program, but also find a place for feedback, and also allow space for manufacturers to network and learn from each other around supply chain issues, around material health, et cetera. And I bring this up because these are, you know, a lot of these manufacturers are the manufacturers that have been interested in really creating living products and moving towards leadership within sustainability. And what it's transformed into is a group that's really trying to speak to the market with a common voice. And so last year as a group, the Living Product 50 wrote a letter to architects and designers that were really thanking them for the sort of the push that they've created in sustainability that has caused them to create a lot of sustainability certifications to achieve a number of transparency documentation, really thanking them for that push and talking about their commitment to sustainability. But then beyond that, really asking for the design community to really demonstrate how sustainability and how an investment in sustainability by manufacturers is changing the way that the architecture and design community is specifying products, and asking them to sort of make that information really publicly available so that manufacturers can continue to invest into these programs. And so I'm not sure that I have the website up here, but if the Living Product 50 is something that any of you are interested in learning more about, you can reach out to my email and kind of learn about what we're working on as a group. And additionally, for more information about the Living Product Challenge, this is the kind of the best email address to reach us at, and start to think about how to create or how to specify products that are really working towards having a positive impact. And last plug that I have is just for the Living Product Expo. At ILFI, we have two main conferences a year. One is Living Future, which is really based around all of our programs pretty strongly, which is in Seattle every year. And then in September, October this year, we've previously been in Pittsburgh and we'll be in Nashville this year for the Living Product Expo, which is really focused on showcasing products that are really pushing sustainability within the built environment. But additionally, really trying to think about these concepts of material transparency and optimization, regenerative manufacturing, and living products, and how as a manufacturing and design community, we can all push towards having a future with healthy products for all. And so that's all for me, and thank you all so much for listening. And I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
Well, great. That was an excellent presentation. Thanks so much, Alex. We do have a couple of questions, and I have a few questions as well. First, really quickly, someone wants to know if the slides will be available, and yes, they will be available on the GC3 website. So the next question, I have one, and then there's one that came from one of our participants that I think are related, and it has to do with the measuring of handprint and footprint. And as I listened to you, I wondered about, in some cases you're comparing oranges and oranges, in some cases it's apples and oranges in terms of the types of either negative or positive impacts.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how would you determine that a handprint is bigger than a footprint? And I'm going to throw in this other question as well, which I think is related, asking, does there need to be a direct nexus between the product that a company is making or their manufacturing process to the positive impact counted in the handprint? For example, this participant said, I can envision a company making and selling beverages in single-use plastic bottles and then offsetting it by donating their used computers to local nonprofits. So again, the apples and oranges element of how you would measure these two things, I'm curious how you wrestle with that as you're trying to think about certification.
Sure. Yeah, those are great questions. we do have a requirement that says that living products can't be single-use plastic items. But to get to the real question, so when you have a footprint, right? If we just think about carbon and carbon and energy and water, right? So we're thinking about, let's say, the the sourcing of wood. And when we think about that wood, right, it's going to have a footprint in those like three. I mean, there's a myriad of different types of footprints that it has. But you can look at let's say for this for a square foot of flooring, the amount of wood that goes into that, and therefore the footprint that it has around water or energy or carbon. It does not have to be directly related to the product to create a handprint. There are some cases in which it could be, right? There are some cases in which the use of a certain type of product can actually have a handprint or create positive impact versus what you would have done with a sort of standard product. For example, right, let's say, and let's think about like a use phase handprint. So you have two types of wood flooring, for example, or you make a wood floor, right? And right now, the requirement is that you have to clean it with a certain amount of water, and you also have to use a cleaning product or certain types of chemicals to clean that. If you re-engineer the product, for example, and change the instructions to say, you only need to sweep this, you don't need to use as much water, you certainly don't need to use the cleaning products anymore, and you were able to change consumer actions, that's directly tied to the product, and that would be considered a handprint. But in other cases, you may have reduced the footprint of that flooring as much as possible, and there isn't really anything more that you can do with consumer engagement. Well, then there's a need to sort of look outside of there as a company and say, are there things that we could do elsewhere? We've had companies that have looked at installing renewable energy on local schools, or the donation of products that would allow affordable housing to invest in renewable energy or water efficiency measures on site. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to that. It's just that you need to be able to compare, in terms of the measurement, the energy footprint to the energy handprint of the action. And even the energy handprint, right? There is some footprint that's required, for example, to create an LED light bulb. And so you would have to look at what sort of the net of that positive impact that's created and compare the two. Just to add on to that quickly, right? So there are cases, it's a very interesting, and it's why we started to think more about context, and are there, sometimes if you're creating all of the energy impacts and benefits and savings for just the architecture firms that you're selling to, right? Could you be doing more good by actually having those impacts with communities that would benefit more from the savings and from education and engagement? There are some areas, and Sally, I think we touched on this at one point, that are interesting and where we don't currently recognize handprints, or not in this sort of in this measured sense, which is, let's say, material health, for example, right? Or kind of health impacts are an interesting one, right? If you were to create a product and use certain, let's say you used a chemical that was not so great over here, but then you also saved a certain amount of usage of problematic chemicals over here, or swap them out. That's something that should be lauded, any switch, any improvements that are made to chemistry. But that direct comparison, I think, just morally feels a little bit stranger when it's coming down to health and toxicity. So I hope that helps with the question. The actions are very different, but in the same way that you can take footprints and break them down into those different aspects, you can also do the same with handprints. And I think what it really does when you start to bring handprints into the equation, they are bounded by certain requirements, and they have to be within a certain time constraint. but I think that you can really change how people think about sustainability. I think there's a lot of people who sort of go around with their head in the sand. And I mean, I do this too on some days, right? You just can't look at the problem because it's so big and you feel like you're part of it. And then if you start to bring in handprints, it's a way of sort of changing the narrative and thinking about how you have this potential for endless positive impact.
Okay, I have a bunch more questions, but just one quick follow-up to that. In order to, that was really helpful, but in order to say that a product is net positive, would all of the handprint activities have to somehow zero out the footprint activity, the footprint elements?
Sure. So the requirement is, and you can achieve net positive there are different imperatives, right? So there's for water, there's for energy, there's for carbon. Carbon does not have an on-site requirement. It's the only one that just has a life cycle requirement. But if we use water and energy as an example, the requirement within our program to claim that your product is net positive is your on-site functionality as it pertains to that product is net positive. So you have enough renewable energy to demonstrate 105% renewable energy for the creation of that product on site. And then you also have to look within the life cycle of the product to demonstrate that through hand printing, you are creating more positive impact than it takes to create that product. And it sales year on year. And it requires, it requires engagement over time. You can't really just create the handprint and sit back on your laurels, because if you're continuing to create things, you have to continue to create handprints to offset that over time. So we have annual check-ins for the program to make sure that people are on track year on year to be net positive.
So how do you take into consideration potentially unintended negative consequences of impacts on the ecosystem that are intended to be positive or regenerative?
An It's a great question. I think we experience that in all areas of sustainability. There's a bit of an echo right now. I think what you do is the same thing that you do with looking at your footprint and trying to bound that with reasonable assumptions. And I think that tracking those impacts is important as well, right? If you install water efficient shower heads, for example, because they save a lot of water, you should be also tracking that impact to make sure that somebody doesn't feel like the water isn't as full as it once was, and they're taking 3 times the length of shower, and going to offset that. I think, and also creating certain there are more complex types of actions that you can take. And so it's an interesting question. And I think that over time, all of these things are sort of improved and perfected. And in some ways, right, life cycle assessment, if you have one consultant do a life cycle assessment and you have another consultant do a life cycle assessment, they may come up with different results, right? There are assumptions that you have to make. There are decisions that you have to make about how to balance things. There's also PCRs for that. But I think that you sort of do the best that you can with those assumptions. I think the same thing can happen, right, with footprint reductions and not just with handprints. And I think that over time, you can work to sort of establish what types of handprinting action. This is one thing that we really want to do, right, is what are the types of handprinting actions that really work, and could we have others start to implement those? We don't need to reinvent the wheel every time somebody creates a handprint, right? How could we eventually have a database or a library of actions that one could put into place? And so I think that there are some things that are really clear, positive impacts, really clearly on all fronts, make the world better. And then there are going to be some areas where, where there are unintended negative impacts. And that's me being sort of frank, but I think when we're looking at these actions, I think that people try to think through those. You try to look at what the impacts are what is the transportation that's required to achieve this, et cetera, and work to sort of diminish those uncertainties wherever possible. That's a great question.
This is a follow-on. I think, well, let me just read this question. So the activities you're describing as part of the handprint, such as donating low-flow showers, energy-efficient light bulbs, are, these are activities that have been documented for years in corporate social responsibility reports for community engagement kinds of things.
Yep.
So is the new thing here that the hand printing really works to measure and quantify those investments, compares them against the footprint, and then, through the quantification is really incentivizing companies to do them and measure them?
Yes, that is absolutely. It's hand printing is not the invention of doing good things. I think that's part of what we're trying to do with the Living Product Challenge and with this concept of hand printing is, yes, so measuring, maximizing, and celebrating that positive impact. And so for some companies, there are things that they've been doing. But for example, in some cases, you installed, you did an efficiency upgrade 5-10 years ago. That wouldn't necessarily count, and you'd have to go beyond to create more positive impact. But it's not the creation of positive impact. It's trying to be really intentional about how much of that you create, where you create it, and really trying to think about comparing the handprint and the footprint, and how can we get to a point where all of our products are made in this way, and are able to have positive impact. That's a great way of breaking it down as the question went.
All right, 2 more quick questions. Is there a list of certified products and manufacturers by state on your website?
That's a great question. So there are, I'll give you a couple answers to that. So we have the case studies that are listed on the website right now, and the location is listed on there. Right now, it's still a fairly new program, and so there are 23 certified products, although I will say that, as I noted, one of those is Mohawks, which covers about 50 different distinct products that they would make. So those are listed with case studies on the website. They will also be incorporated later this year into our Declare database. And there's also a connection within Mindful Materials to recognize Living Product Challenge now as well. So Sally, those links and that information are things that I can pass along to you to send out to attendees.
Great, thank you. And then just one last question. I'm thinking about this from the green chemistry perspective. One of the elements is to avoid red list chemicals. Then there's another element, which is that green screen assessments are done on any kind of ingredient. Is there anything that's any measurement that's related to actually determining whether the ingredients are indeed greener or safer chemistries?
So the requirement, there's, as we speak, I think I was saying this before, I actually have, I'm working on an update to that imperative. Is called Transparent Material Health. The pages are laid out under my computer. So the requirement is that you use the red list to screen, disclose all of the ingredients and avoid red list chemicals, use green screen list translator to sort of easily identify chemicals with problematic hazard profiles, and then conduct green screens for applicable chemicals. And within there, if you identified that a product was a carcinogen, mutagen, or reprotoxic, or PBT, then if you were looking to actually switch out that ingredient, and we also use the safer chemicals ingredients list to screen chemicals, you would be looking at what is the, if you're swapping that out, looking for a preferable alternative based on its green screen profile.
Okay, yeah, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, that is all the questions, and we're at the hour, and I really want to thank you. You did a great job answering some challenging questions, and this was a really informative webinar. So thanks so much, Alex.
Yeah, no, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.